Thank you for being here. What you're about to hear might completely shift how you see this story. Once the pieces connect, it becomes impossible to ignore. When most people hear the name Jeffrey Epstein, they think of private jets, powerful elites, and the scandals that rocked the United States and Europe. But what if I told you that the story doesn't end there? What if part of it stretches into West Africa, into politics, influence, and quiet power moves that rarely make international headlines? There's a side of this case that has been sitting in plain sight, yet almost no one talks about it. Not because it's fictional, not because it's hidden behind locked vaults, but because the global spotlight rarely points in that direction. Today, we're going to look where few people have bothered to look. Is widely known as a financier who cultivated relationships with influential figures across governments, academia, and business. He was a convicted sex offender and became the center of one of the most disturbing scandals of our time. The media covered his connections in New York, London, Paris. But beyond those cities, beyond the familiar names, his network extended further than many realized. And Africa was not just a footnote. When investigators reviewed Epstein's passport applications and travel history, certain details raised eyebrows. He applied for multiple passports and listed international destinations, including Senegal. Why Senegal? Why West Africa? That question alone opens a door most people never walk through. Now, to be clear, not every trip is fully documented. Some records are redacted. Some details remain unclear. But what is documented shows that Epstein traveled extensively, often to regions where wealthy businessmen and political influencers can operate quietly, far from the intense scrutiny of Western media. West Africa, like many developing regions, has long been a space where global financiers, investors, and political intermediaries seek opportunity, sometimes legitimate, sometimes strategic, sometimes far more complex. Influence in these regions doesn't always look like front-page headlines. It often looks like partnerships, private meetings, development promises, or discreet investments. And here's what makes this important. Global power is rarely confined to one continent. Networks thrive in places where oversight is lighter and attention is lower. When powerful figures expand their reach, they do so strategically. So the real question isn't simply whether Epstein traveled to Africa. The real question is, why? Was it business? Influence building? Political access? Surveillance relationships? Quiet alliances? The full picture may never be completely revealed, but the pattern itself tells a story about how global networks operate across borders, often unnoticed. Africa is too often treated as irrelevant in international scandals, as if major power plays only happen in Washington, London, or Brussels. But power doesn't work that way. It flows where opportunity exists. It expands where scrutiny is limited. And sometimes, the most important parts of a global story are the ones that receive the least attention. Today, we're pulling that thread. Because once you start looking at the Africa connection, the narrative shifts. The map widens. And the idea that this was only an American or European story begins to feel incomplete. Stay with me, because what we're about to explore challenges the version of events most people think they already understand. He built relationships inside African political circles and placed himself precisely where money, intelligence, and state security intersect. That overlap, where governments feel pressure and private actors offer solutions, is often where influence takes root. Let's talk about one of the clearest cases, Ivory Coast. In 2010, Ivory Coast was thrown into a severe political crisis. A disputed presidential election triggered violence, international tension, and a fragile transfer of power. The country was under enormous pressure to stabilize quickly. Institutions were strained. Trust was fractured. And in moments like that, governments become highly receptive to outside assistance, especially when it promises control and security. During that period, investigative records and leaked communications pointed to something unexpected. Jeffrey Epstein was reportedly facilitating introductions between influential Israeli security figures and members of the incoming Ivorian leadership. Central to this was his close relationship with Ehud Barak, a former prime minister and defense minister of Israel with deep ties to defense and intelligence sectors. And what were these conversations about? Not humanitarian aid, not infrastructure development, not public health initiatives. The discussions reportedly focused on surveillance systems. Proposals included establishing advanced monitoring infrastructure in Abidjan, systems capable of tracking mobile phone communications, monitoring internet traffic, identifying political opponents, and centralizing intelligence data into a coordinated hub. These were not casual suggestions. They were structured proposals emerging from communications linked to security contractors and networks connected to Epstein. Now consider the timing. The new government under Alassane Ouattara was consolidating power after a volatile election cycle. Human rights organizations later reported concerns about political suppression and expanded surveillance in the years that followed. While correlation does not automatically equal causation, the overlap between crisis, security proposals, and expanding state monitoring raises legitimate questions. Why was Epstein positioned as a bridge between political leadership and private security interests? Who invited him into that space? And perhaps most importantly, what did he stand to gain? This dimension of the story rarely appears in mainstream documentaries. Most narratives focus on his social circles in New York or London. But when you examine his international footprint, you start to see a different pattern: proximity to power during moments of instability. So why Africa? There are strategic reasons. Parts of Africa have historically been treated as peripheral in global media coverage. When major political or security shifts occur there, they rarely dominate Western headlines for long. For foreign actors seeking influence without constant scrutiny, that environment can be attractive. If someone wants to shape surveillance infrastructure quietly, they do not begin in Washington, D.C. or London, cities saturated with investigative journalists and parliamentary oversight. They look to regions where oversight structures are still developing, where governments urgently need stability, and where deals can be framed as security partnerships. And here is the larger implication. This was not just about one country. It reflects a broader pattern in global geopolitics. Private financiers positioning themselves as intermediaries in sensitive state matters. When wealth, intelligence services, political vulnerability, and foreign contractors converge, the lines between diplomacy and private influence blur. That is what makes this chapter of the Epstein story so revealing. It suggests that his network was not merely social or financial. It may have intersected with state-level security conversations in regions far from the usual spotlight. And once you begin to see that pattern, you start to ask a bigger question. Was Africa an exception or part of a much wider strategy? Stay with me, because the deeper we go, the clearer the structure of this network becomes. Second, African governments have for years been encouraged, and at times pressured, to adopt foreign-made security infrastructure. Surveillance technology is a multi-billion-dollar global industry. Companies market these systems as tools for counterterrorism, election stability, and crime prevention. In moments of political fragility, those offers can sound less like optional upgrades and more like urgent necessities. Third, Africa is rarely placed at the center of international investigations. Even when documentation exists, it often sits buried in appendices and footnotes rather than headlines. That reality creates a strategic blind spot. And individuals operating through complex international networks understand blind spots very well. Influence tends to move toward environments where scrutiny is lighter and access points are fewer. Now, precision matters here. There is no confirmed evidence that Jeffrey Epstein ran a sex trafficking operation in Africa. Nothing in the publicly released files establishes that. It is important not to stretch beyond documented facts. What is documented, however, is this. He traveled to African countries for reasons connected to business and political elites. He facilitated introductions related to surveillance and intelligence discussions. He had the capital, the global connections, and the diplomatic access to operate discreetly. And African governments factored into his broader international network. When power, secrecy, financial leverage, and political instability intersect, risk increases. Not necessarily because every actor has criminal intent, but because accountability mechanisms are weaker in transitional environments. So the deeper question becomes, how much influence did his network establish in Africa that remains largely invisible today?